So, back in the late 1800s, especially around the year 1895, there was this funny little nickname floating around in newspapers and polite conversations: Dollar Princess. Now at first, it sounds almost like a fairy tale title, doesn't it? A princess made out of dollars, maybe a figure sitting on a golden throne surrounded by coins. But no, it wasn't that at all. The phrase was used to describe a very real social trend, something that was happening between two very different worlds: wealthy American families and the old, traditional aristocracy of Europe. These young women weren't actual princesses born into royalty, but, in a way, they became princesses through the marriages they entered into. They were the daughters of millionaires and billionaires of their time: railroad magnates, oil tycoons, steel industrialists. Families who had more money than most people could even imagine, but no titles, no coats of arms, no castles in the English countryside. To understand why people started calling them dollar princesses, you have to picture both sides of the story. On one hand, you have these enormous European estates, grand country houses with dozens of rooms, sweeping gardens, libraries with ancient books, and ballrooms that once echoed with music and laughter. But by the end of the 19th century, many of those families who owned them were running out of money. Farming, which had supported the nobility for centuries, wasn't making enough profit anymore. Industrialization had changed the economy. The dukes, earls, and counts of Europe had all the prestige, but often none of the cash to keep their roofs from leaking. Some of them were literally boarding up wings of their houses, unable to pay for repairs or even enough servants to keep things running. Now, look across the Atlantic Ocean. In America, things were booming. The Gilded Age had created fortunes so massive they almost didn't make sense. Families like the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Goulds, they had railroads, steel factories, shipping lines, and oil empires. Their money could buy anything except, well, respectability in the eyes of the old-world aristocracy. In Europe, people sometimes sniffed at Americans, calling them new money. It didn't matter how many carriages they owned, or how many diamonds sparkled around their necks. They didn't have centuries of lineage, coats of arms, or ancient family trees that could trace back to medieval knights. To the European elite, Americans were seen as flashy, maybe even a little uncultured, too loud, too eager. And so here was the perfect solution. The daughters of these American millionaires could marry the sons of European nobles. The families with too much money but no titles could join with the families who had titles but no money. It was, in some ways, a business arrangement wrapped up in lace and roses. Imagine it. A duke with a crumbling castle desperately needing funds, standing beside a bride who had trunks full of silk gowns and a dowry large enough to restore the roof, refill the wine cellar, and pay off all the debts. Both sides got something they wanted. The nobleman secured his estate and his lifestyle. The American family secured a title, a place in European society, and the glamorous story that their daughter had become a duchess or a countess. The name Dollar Princess stuck because it summed up the whole idea in just 2 words. Dollars represented the wealth these American women brought into their marriages, and Princess highlighted the shiny new status they gained when they crossed the Atlantic. Newspapers in both America and Europe loved writing about these matches. They described the gowns, the jewels, the enormous dowries, and of course the castles being saved from ruin. For the public, it was like following real-life fairy tales, except these stories weren't always happy or romantic, as you'll see later. But in 1895, when the term was especially popular, there was an air of fascination around the whole phenomenon. Now imagine yourself living in that time. The year is 1895. You are in New York City, where mansions on Fifth Avenue sparkle with gaslight and are filled with gilded furniture, marble staircases, and chandeliers imported from France. The families inside are throwing enormous parties, sometimes with hundreds of guests, orchestras playing until dawn, and champagne flowing as though it were water. Yet behind all this glitter, there is a whisper of insecurity. The mothers of these young heiresses want something more than just money. They want recognition. They want their daughters to stand shoulder to shoulder with the most respected names of Europe. To them, a marriage to a duke or an earl is worth more than any diamond tiara. It is the final stamp of legitimacy. Now imagine on the other side, in England or France. You are a nobleman, proud of your family crest and your long ancestral line. But your grand estate is cold. Your staff is reduced to only a few loyal servants, and the bills are piling up. You remember your grandfather's days when balls were held every season and carriages lined the drive. But now, the only way to restore that life is to find someone with money. You could marry a local woman, but most noble families nearby are in the same situation as you, titles without wealth. So, your eyes wander across the Atlantic, to those American families you once dismissed. They have what you need. This combination created marriages that were sometimes glamorous, sometimes strained, and always fascinating to those who watched from the outside. The dollar princesses stepped into worlds that were full of old traditions and strict rules, but they also brought something new: energy, money, and a touch of American boldness. Some European aristocrats may have rolled their eyes at their new bride's accents or habits, but they couldn't argue with the wealth that came along with them. One of the reasons people in 1895 found this so interesting was because it almost sounded like a story turned upside down. Traditionally, in fairy tales, it is the poor girl who marries the wealthy prince. But here, it was the wealthy girl who was marrying the broke prince. Instead of castles rescuing maidens, the maidens were rescuing the castles. People joked about it, admired it, criticized it, and dreamed about it. And the term dollar princess became part of the culture, a shorthand for this very unique meeting of money and title, America and Europe, new and old. Of course, behind the nickname there were real people, real feelings, and sometimes real struggles. Some of these women were pressured into marriages they didn't want. Some found love despite the arrangement. Others lived lives of duty rather than romance. But all of them represented a bridge between two continents at a time when the world was rapidly changing. And so, when you hear the phrase dollar princess, think of a moment in history where glittering ballrooms in New York connected with crumbling castles in England. Think of the steamships crossing the Atlantic, loaded with trunks of dresses and jewels. Think of mothers whispering about titles and fathers writing checks for dowries. It was a time of deals and dreams, of wealth and heritage trading hands under the cover of romance. And in 1895, people were watching it all, half in wonder, half in envy, as if they were seeing a modern fairy tale unfold right before their eyes. By the 1890s, America was a place of unstoppable growth and booming industries. The country had changed so much in just a few decades that it was almost unrecognizable from the days of the Civil War. Cities were rising higher with new buildings of steel and glass, trains were weaving their way across the continent, and factories filled with noise and smoke were producing goods at a pace the world had never seen before. Steel, oil, and railroads were at the heart of this transformation. These industries didn't just create jobs, they created empires. And the people at the top of these industries weren't just wealthy, they were unimaginably, almost ridiculously wealthy. Families like the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Goulds became household names, not just in America but eventually in Europe too, because of the scale of their fortunes. Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example, had built his empire on shipping and railroads, and his children and grandchildren inherited sums that ordinary people couldn't even dream about. The Astors had made their money first in fur trading and later in real estate, owning some of the most valuable properties in New York. The Goulds were known for railroads and for their shrewd, sometimes ruthless business deals. To give you an idea of scale, a Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue could cost millions to build at a time when the average working man earned only a few $100s a year. Their parties could cost tens of thousands of dollars in a single night, enough to pay the lifetime wages of several families. This new wealth gave America an energy and sparkle that was hard to ignore. New York, Chicago, and other cities were buzzing with carriages, opera houses, clubs, and enormous private homes. If you walked down Fifth Avenue in the 1890s, you'd see rows of glittering mansions, each one trying to outshine the next with taller columns, more gold, bigger chandeliers, and ever more elaborate ballrooms. Wealthy women wore gowns imported from Paris, dripping in pearls and diamonds, while men paraded about in tailored suits, riding in private carriages pulled by the finest horses. If there was a word to describe the mood, it was excess. More of everything, bigger, brighter, shinier. But here's the catch. As wealthy as these families were, as dazzling as their lives appeared in the newspapers, American society still carried a kind of insecurity. They were rich, yes, but in the eyes of the old world across the Atlantic, they were considered what people called new money. That phrase might sound harmless, but in the social language of the time, it carried a sting. It meant that no matter how much gold they piled up, no matter how many parties they hosted, their money couldn't buy them the one thing Europe valued most: history. In Europe, especially in countries like England and France, social class wasn't built on wealth alone. It was built on centuries of lineage, on names that carried weight because they were tied to land, to titles, to battles fought long ago. A duke or an earl might have little money left in his bank account, but his family name carried stories that went back generations. Americans, in comparison, had fortunes that were only a few decades old. To European eyes, they were seen as flashy, unrefined, sometimes even vulgar. It didn't matter that their ballrooms sparkled brighter than Versailles, or that their jewelry rivaled royal collections. They lacked the centuries of tradition that European aristocracy guarded so closely. This judgment was something that Americans felt deeply. If you were a Vanderbilt or an Astor, you might be the queen of New York society, but if you traveled to London, you were just another outsider with a lot of money. Invitations to the most exclusive European gatherings were rare, and even when they were extended, they often came with whispers behind the scenes. Europeans would marvel at the size of American dowries but raise their eyebrows at their manners, their voices, or even the way they dressed. It created a strange tension. In America, these families ruled social life. They decided who was in and who was out. They controlled clubs, dinners, operas, and summer seasons in Newport. But outside their borders, they were still craving recognition, craving legitimacy in a world that dismissed them. The mothers of these families especially felt this tension. They wanted their daughters to have more than just money. They wanted their daughters to step into a world where titles mattered, where respect wasn't bought but inherited. Meanwhile, the fortunes themselves were continuing to grow at dizzying speed. Oil barons like John D. Rockefeller were amassing sums so vast that even other millionaires were left in awe. Industrialists like Andrew Carnegie controlled steel, while bankers like J.P. Morgan were reshaping the financial systems of the country. Their combined influence made America a rising giant on the world stage, but the people at the top of that pyramid still looked longingly at the castles and coronets of Europe. They wanted to belong to that other world, the one that seemed older, grander, and somehow more permanent than even their enormous fortunes. This longing explains why the marriages between wealthy American daughters and European noblemen became such a powerful trend. It was a trade that filled gaps on both sides. For Europe, these Americans brought money, enough to restore estates, repair roofs, and fund lifestyles that had become impossible to maintain. For America, these unions brought something money alone couldn't buy: titles, coats of arms, and social respect that stretched back centuries. In New York, drawing rooms, the talk often circled around who might be next. Which daughter would catch the eye of a duke? Which count might need a dowry? Which marriage would be written up in both American and British papers? Newspapers loved these stories because they were filled with glamour, numbers, and a touch of scandal. People read about how many millions a bride brought into the marriage, what her dress looked like, how many pearls were sewn into her veil. Behind the sparkle, though, was that tension between wealth and status, between new and old, between America's energy and Europe's tradition. The irony, of course, is that while Europe looked down on these Americans for being new money, It was exactly that new money that was keeping many noble families afloat. Castles that might have been abandoned were kept alive with American dowries. Ballrooms that had fallen silent rang again with music, thanks to American dollars. Servants were rehired, gardens replanted, debts paid off. In a way, Europe was being quietly rescued by the very people they had once sneered at. Still, the label of new money stuck, and it shaped the way Americans viewed themselves in that era. They worked harder to impress, throwing even bigger parties, wearing even more elaborate gowns, building even grander houses, as if to prove that their wealth was enough to earn them a place at the table of history. But deep down, many of them knew that no matter how high they built their mansions in New York, the respect they craved was waiting across the ocean, in the form of a title, a crest, or a marriage into an ancient family. So by the 1890s, America was bursting with riches, but it was also buzzing with a kind of hunger. It wasn't just a hunger for more money, but for validation, for status, for a sense of permanence that only Europe seemed able to provide. The term new money may have been meant as an insult, but it also captured the truth of the time. America was still young, still building its identity, still balancing the excitement of its booming industries with the insecurity of being dismissed by the old world. And into that mix stepped the daughters of these families, the young women who would become dollar princesses, carrying their families, fortunes, and dreams across the Atlantic in search of something more than money could buy. By the time the 1890s were in full swing, the contrast between Europe and America could not have been clearer. On one side of the ocean stood the powerful United States, overflowing with new fortunes from oil, railroads, steel, and banking. On the other side stood Europe, with its palaces, grand titles, and centuries of tradition. But behind all that glamour, there was often a quiet, uncomfortable truth. Many of these noble families were nearly broke. Their wealth had thinned, their houses were crumbling, and their way of life was slipping out of reach. Imagine a duke, proud of his lineage, walking through a castle so vast that even his footsteps seemed to echo endlessly, but knowing deep down that he couldn't afford to heat half the rooms in the winter. The chandeliers still hung in the ballrooms, but the candles were lit less often. The gardens still stretched out for acres, but fewer gardeners were left to tend them. It was as if the glory of the past still lingered, but only faintly, like the echo of a song long finished. For centuries, European nobility had lived off the land. Their estates brought in money from farms, from peasants who paid rent, from vineyards, orchards, and mills. But the 19th century was a time of enormous change. Industrialization had swept through Europe just as it had in America. Cities grew, factories rose, and traditional agriculture, once the bedrock of noble wealth, no longer provided enough to sustain their grand lifestyles. Wheat and grain prices fell, farming profits collapsed, and slowly, the great estates that had supported generations began to run dry. It was a quiet crisis, but one that could be seen in every corner of aristocratic life. Houses that had once needed 100 servants now had only a handful. Ballrooms that had once hosted glittering dances stood empty and cold. Some noble families had to sell off heirlooms, paintings, jewels, even entire libraries, just to keep themselves afloat. Others married within their own circles, trading what little money was left in one family with the prestige of another. But that strategy rarely worked for long. The titles were plentiful, but the money was not. And so, slowly, their eyes began to wander across the Atlantic. At first, the idea of marrying Americans seemed absurd to many of these noblemen and women. They considered Americans too brash, too loud, too fond of showing off their wealth. It was one thing to host a party in Paris with 100 guests. It was another to read about Americans hosting parties with 500 complete, with rivers of champagne and ice sculptures that melted before the night was over. But as the debts piled higher and the estates grew colder, pride began to bend. Tradition was beautiful, yes, but it could not pay the bills. Titles alone could not fix a leaking roof. Nobility alone could not restore a garden to its former bloom. What they needed was money. Lots of it. And Americans, it seemed, had more of it than anyone else. There was a certain irony in it all. European nobility had once looked down on these Americans for their lack of heritage, but now they began to welcome them, or at least tolerate them, because their fortunes offered survival. A nobleman might once have laughed at the idea of marrying the daughter of a railroad tycoon, but when faced with the choice between watching his family estate crumble or securing a dowry that could save it, the laughter often faded. Marriages, after all, had long been used as practical arrangements in Europe. Kings and queens had married for alliances, land, and power. Now, in the 1890s, dukes and counts were marrying for something just as necessary: cash. Think of a young earl, barely 25, standing on the steps of his ancestral home. The estate stretches out behind him. Hundreds of acres of forest and farmland, a house with turrets and towers, halls decorated with portraits of ancestors in armor. It is beautiful, yes, but it is also a burden. The roof leaks when it rains. The windows rattle with the wind. The staff has been cut so thin that many rooms have been closed off entirely, dust covering the furniture. His father warns him that unless something changes, the estate will have to be sold. The only solution? A wealthy marriage. Now imagine him meeting a young American woman, her family newly rich from oil, stepping off a ship in Southampton. She brings trunks of gowns, glittering diamonds, and a dowry that could not only save the estate, but restore it to its former splendor. Suddenly, the match doesn't sound so unthinkable. This was the backdrop against which the phenomenon of the dollar princess was born. On one side, Europe had titles and names that stretched back to medieval times, but little money left to support them. On the other side, America had more money than anyone knew what to do with, but no titles, no ancient crests, no place in the delicate hierarchy of European society. Together, they formed a trade that suited both. The Americans offered their fortunes. The Europeans offered their names. And the world watched, half curious, half amused, as these two very different societies intertwined. It wasn't just about the families either. It was about the symbolism. For Europe, taking American money was a quiet admission that times had changed. Industrial power across the ocean had created fortunes larger than centuries of land ownership. For America, marrying into European nobility was a chance to finally shake off the label of new money and claim something more permanent, more respected. Each side was giving up something and gaining something in return. The nobleman gave up a little pride, but gained the wealth to keep his estate alive. The American family gave up their daughter, sometimes reluctantly, but gained the prestige of seeing her titled, addressed as Your Grace or Lady. Of course, not every European noble was desperate, and not every American was eager, but by the mid-1890s the pattern had become so common that it could not be ignored. Newspapers in London, Paris, and New York began to write about it frequently. They reported on the size of dowries, the details of weddings, the estates being repaired with American fortunes. Some people admired these unions, seeing them as practical and even romantic bridges between two worlds. Others criticized them, claiming they were loveless transactions disguised as marriages. But whatever the opinion, everyone was fascinated. It's easy to imagine why. These stories had everything: castles, carriages, fortunes, gowns, titles, and the drama of two worlds colliding. To the public, they were like real-life fairy tales, though with a twist. The damsels weren't being rescued by princes. Instead, the damsels were rescuing the princes, or at least their castles, with their mountains of American dollars. The balance of power had shifted, and that shift fascinated everyone who read about it. In quiet moments, though, for the families directly involved, it was not always so magical. For the European nobleman, there was sometimes a sting in admitting that his survival depended on marrying a woman he might not love, or one who came from a culture he didn't fully respect. For the American bride, there was sometimes sadness in leaving behind her family, her country, and stepping into a world of stiff rules, formal dinners, and expectations that could feel suffocating. And yet, for many, duty outweighed personal feelings. A marriage was not just between two people, it was between two continents, two ways of life, two needs trying to balance each other. By 1895, this reality had become part of the social fabric. Europe, with its proud but struggling nobility, and America, with its booming but insecure elite, were tied together by the marriages of dollar princesses. Each ship that crossed the Atlantic seemed to carry not only trunks of gowns and jewels, but also the hopes of families on both sides. And so, slowly, old castles were repaired, new names were added to ancient family trees, and history itself was reshaped by these unlikely unions. So here was the deal everyone seemed to want. On the surface, it looked almost like a fairy tale, but underneath it was really about balance. Balance between what one side had too much of and what the other side lacked. In Europe, the noble families had names that opened doors, titles that carried weight, and histories that stretched back through the centuries. They had castles, grand estates, and family crests carved into stone above their doorways. But many of them had little money left to keep those doors open or those estates standing. In America, the new millionaires of steel, oil, and railroads had money pouring in faster than they could spend it. They had built mansions so tall and wide that they seemed to cover entire city blocks. They had diamonds sewn into the hems of gowns and fountains bubbling in their front halls. But for all of that, they didn't have titles. They didn't have Duke or Countess or Lady attached to their names. To them, Europe's nobility looked like a glittering world they could see but not touch, unless, of course, a marriage made the bridge possible. So the trade began, quietly at first, but soon it was the talk of high society. Dowries were offered, titles were secured, and both sides pretended that this was about romance when most people knew it was about survival and ambition. A young American woman, daughter of a man who had made his fortune in railroads, might find herself being courted by a British duke. He could offer her a castle, a coat of arms, and a title that would echo through drawing rooms and society columns. She could offer him the money to repair the castle's roof, to hire back the servants, to restock the cellars, and to restore his family's pride. Each side got something it craved. Each side gave something in return. Of course, the newspapers loved every detail. When an American heiress married into nobility, reporters described the jewels, the gowns, the carriages, the grand ceremonies. They listed the dowries in shocking numbers, millions of dollars handed over at a time when most working families survived on a few $100s a year. Readers were fascinated. Some were enchanted by the glamour, seeing it as the modern version of a Cinderella story. Others shook their heads, muttering that love had no place in these arrangements, that they were nothing more than business deals dressed up in lace and velvet. But whether they admired or criticized, people could not stop reading. Inside the families themselves, the negotiations could be surprisingly blunt. A nobleman might visit America, attend a dinner party on Fifth Avenue, and be introduced to a young woman whose family fortune was as large as his debts. He might charm her with stories of his estate, of fox hunts and gardens, of centuries-old traditions. Her parents, especially her mother, might lean in and ask discreet but pointed questions about the title, the land, and the responsibilities their daughter would inherit. Meanwhile, the nobleman would be asking equally pointed questions about the size of the dowry, the income from the railroads, the value of the oil wells. It was business, though everyone tried to dress it up as romance. But not all of it was cold calculation. Sometimes sparks of genuine affection did appear. After all, these were young people meeting each other, sometimes discovering shared laughter, shared dreams, or simply shared curiosity about worlds so different from their own. An American heiress might find the idea of living in a castle exciting, full of mystery and history. A European noble might find the energy and confidence of an American bride refreshing, even liberating compared to the reserved and often rigid circles he had grown up in. Love wasn't always absent, though it was rarely the main reason the match was made. For the young women involved, the deal was often complicated. On one hand, they were stepping into lives that sounded dazzling. They would be addressed as Your Grace, ride in carriages past cheering crowds, host dinners in ancient halls, and wear tiaras that had been passed down for centuries. They would be written about in newspapers, admired in society, and elevated to a status that few Americans could even dream of. But on the other hand, they were also leaving behind the world they knew, the comfort of their homes, the freedom of American society. They were entering households full of traditions, rules, and expectations that could feel heavy and unyielding. For some, it was a dream come true. For others, it became a gilded cage. Still, for their families, the arrangement almost always seemed worth it. In America, the mothers who had fought for recognition in New York society saw their daughters climb even higher than they could have imagined. To say, "My daughter is the Duchess of Marlborough," or "My daughter is a countess in France," carried a weight that no ballroom in Newport or mansion on Fifth Avenue could match. For the fathers, often self-made men who had started with little and built empires through grit and ambition, these marriages were proof that they had truly made it. They had not only built fortunes, they had built legacies that reached across oceans. For the noble families of Europe, the benefits were equally clear. The money that poured in from these marriages often saved their estates from ruin. Castles were repaired, staff rehired, and the old traditions continued as if nothing had changed. Some noblemen even admitted privately that without their American brides, their families would have lost everything. To them, the deal was not just convenient, it was necessary. Of course, there were critics. Some Europeans grumbled that their nobility was being bought by Americans, that titles were being traded for cash. Some Americans whispered that their daughters were being sacrificed, married off not for love, but for prestige. But the critics never stopped the trend. By 1895, the pattern was too strong, too tempting for both sides, and so the deals continued, one after another, with each wedding feeding the public's fascination. What makes it all so captivating, even now, is how human it was. Beneath the glitter and the grandeur, these were people trying to secure their futures, people trying to find stability in uncertain times. The nobleman didn't want to be the one who lost his family huge as estate after centuries of survival. The American millionaire didn't want his fortune to be dismissed as vulgar or temporary. The daughters, caught in between, were sometimes willing, sometimes reluctant, but always central to the bargain. The deal everyone wanted wasn't just about money or titles. It was about the dreams and fears of a changing world stitched together in lace and gold, signed in the ink of wedding vows, and sealed with the quiet hope that maybe something more than duty could grow from it. And so, in those years, the drawing rooms of New York and the halls of European castles hummed with the same conversations. Who would marry whom? How much money would change hands? What title would be gained? What estate would be saved? It was a cycle that seemed to please everyone involved, at least on the surface, and it created stories that still linger today. Stories of unions that were part love, part business, part survival, and wholly unforgettable. Traveling across the Atlantic in the 1890s was not a quick or simple matter, but it was part of the great adventure that awaited these young women and their families. When an American heiress prepared to marry into European nobility, she did not just pack a small trunk and hop onto a ship. Entire households seemed to move with her, and the voyage itself became a spectacle. Picture the scene. Long lines of servants carrying trunks so large that each one could swallow the wardrobe of an ordinary family. Inside were gowns sewn with pearls, evening dresses from Paris, elaborate hats decorated with feathers and lace, satin gloves, jeweled fans, and entire cases of jewelry. Some even brought along furniture, silver, and artwork, as if they were not just moving across an ocean but transplanting their world into another continent. The ships that carried them were the luxury liners of their day, names like the RMS Campania or the SS Teutonic, vessels that were floating palaces in their own right. First-class cabins were more like grand hotel suites, with velvet curtains, chandeliers, and polished wood panels. Dining rooms served meals that stretched across multiple courses with fine wines and elegant dishes. There were promenades for walking, lounges for reading or gossiping, and orchestras that played music to pass the long hours at sea. For the dollar princesses and their families, the journey was not simply travel. It was a statement. Booking the most expensive cabins, arriving with the most servants, and hosting dinners on board were ways to show everyone else on the ship, and later the newspapers, that they were no ordinary travelers. Yet, even with all the comfort, the journey carried a kind of suspense. The Atlantic Ocean was wide, sometimes rough, and always unpredictable. Days could pass with nothing but water in every direction, the horizon blurring into sky. At night, the sea could feel endless, stretching under the stars like a dark mirror. Passengers might gather on deck, wrapped in coats, staring out at the waves and imagining what awaited them at the other side. For the young women, the crossing was more than physical. It was emotional, too. They were leaving behind the familiar world of New York ballrooms, Newport summers, and American society they understood. Ahead of them lay a land of castles, titles, and traditions that felt both exciting and intimidating. Conversations on board often buzzed with speculation. Mothers might whisper about the dowries and estates waiting for them in England or France. Fathers might speak with bankers and fellow businessmen about opportunities overseas. The young women themselves might gather in small groups, practicing the manners they would need, the way to bow or curtsy correctly, the right words to say at a formal dinner in a castle. Some approached it with excitement, seeing the journey as the beginning of a dream. Others carried a quiet nervousness, wondering if they would truly fit into the world that awaited them. Sometimes noblemen themselves traveled back and forth across the ocean to secure their brides, and the ships became meeting grounds where deals were discussed, introductions made, and reputations quietly judged. Imagine the eyes of other passengers watching as a duke strolled the deck with the daughter of an American millionaire, noting how many times they spoke, what kind of laughter escaped between them, what kind of glances were exchanged. Even in the middle of the sea, society never slept. Every detail was noticed, every conversation whispered about, every possibility turned into a story that would later appear in a newspaper column. The journey could last more than a week, sometimes 2, depending on weather and the speed of the ship. During that time, routines developed. Breakfast was served late for the wealthy passengers, followed by strolls on the deck if the sun was out. Afternoons brought reading, card games, or small concerts arranged in the lounges. In the evenings there were formal dinners, with men in crisp tuxedos and women in glittering gowns, as if they were already practicing for the European ballrooms they were about to enter. The ocean might be vast and lonely, but life on board was its own kind of stage, a rehearsal for the roles they would soon play. But even as they dined and danced on deck, there was always the awareness of the sea itself, a powerful reminder that they were in between worlds. Storms could hit without warning, tossing the ship in heavy waves, sending passengers clutching at railings or retreating to their cabins. Seasickness was common, and the glamour of dinner tables quickly faded when the ocean grew rough. Yet, for all its dangers, the crossing carried a sense of destiny. Each mile brought them closer to a new identity, a new life that would be written into the pages of history. When the ships finally arrived in Europe, at ports like Southampton, Cherbourg, or Le Havre, the atmosphere shifted into one of spectacle. Local newspapers sometimes reported on the arrivals, listing which American families had stepped ashore, how many trunks they had brought, and which noble houses awaited them. Carriages lined the docks, ready to sweep the families off to hotels or directly to country estates. The air was often filled with excitement, but also with scrutiny. Europeans watched closely, eager to see how these wealthy Americans would carry themselves. Were they refined, or were they loud? Did they dress with elegance or too much extravagance? Did they seem nervous or confident? Every gesture mattered, for first impressions in that world carried enormous weight. For the young women stepping onto European soil, it was the moment when imagination turned into reality. The castles they had read about were no longer pictures in books but destinations they would soon see with their own eyes. The titles they had heard spoken in drawing rooms were about to become part of their daily lives. Some must have felt a thrill, like stepping into a story they had always dreamed of. Others must have felt the weight of it all, the realization that their lives would never be the same, that they were now bound to expectations and duties that stretched beyond their own desires. In hindsight, the voyages of these women feel almost cinematic. The trunks, the gowns, the ships cutting across the Atlantic, the grand arrivals in Europe. But in the quiet of their cabins, as the sea rocked them to sleep, it must have felt deeply personal. They were leaving one identity behind and stepping into another, caught between two worlds and carrying the hopes of their families with them. The crossing was not just about distance, it was about transformation. Each voyage turned a daughter of American wealth into a woman poised to become European nobility, and for many of them, it all began on those long days at sea, with nothing but the ocean around them and the promise of a new life waiting just beyond the horizon. When the young American women finally set foot on European soil, the first impressions were often the most important, and sometimes the most difficult. Europe had been watching them from afar, reading about their parties, their gowns, their extravagant families in the newspapers, and now here they were in person, stepping down from carriages in front of grand hotels, arriving at country estates, or being presented at dinners where every eye in the room was waiting to see if the rumors were true. Were these women truly as flashy and bold as people said? Were they too loud, too quick to laugh, too eager to show their wealth? Or were they refined enough to take their place in the intricate world of European nobility? The answer often depended on who was watching and on how carefully these young women carried themselves. Europeans were used to a certain rhythm in social life, a pattern of traditions that had been in place for generations. Dinners had their rules about where guests could sit, about when one should rise, about which fork to use for which course. Balls had their own choreography, from the order of dances to the way a lady was introduced to a potential partner. Even the smallest gestures, how one greeted a duchess, how deeply one curtsied, how softly one spoke, were noted and judged. For American heiresses, these rules could feel overwhelming, almost like learning a new language without ever opening a book. In New York, parties were loud, cheerful, and often chaotic, with laughter that filled the air and champagne that flowed until sunrise. In London or Paris, parties were quieter, more controlled, built on etiquette that stretched back centuries. It was not enough to be rich. One had to act as though one had always belonged. And yet, despite the challenges, the wealth of these women often spoke louder than any social missteps. A countess might whisper about how an American bride laughed too heartily at a joke, but the same countess would attend her ball if it promised to be the most dazzling of the season. A duke might raise an eyebrow at an accent that sounded strange to his ear, but he would still smile at the dowry that came with it. Money, after all, had its own language, and it was one that everyone understood. The castles repaired with American fortunes, the debts paid off with American checks, the dinners funded by American income. All of these things softened criticism and made the newcomers harder to ignore. Still, the whispers were always there. Behind fans and in smoking rooms, people spoke of how Americans dressed too brightly, how they wore too many diamonds at once, how they seemed eager to impress rather than quietly confident. To Europeans who valued restraint, it could feel like too much, too quickly. But there was also admiration, sometimes reluctant, sometimes open. Americans brought a kind of energy that Europe had not seen in a long time. Their parties were larger, their laughter more frequent, their willingness to spend almost without limit. They brought life into ballrooms that had been fading into silence, and in their own way they refreshed a society that had grown tired of its own rules. For the young women themselves, those first impressions were often nerve-wracking. They knew they were being judged at every turn, weighed not only for their wealth but for their manners, their poise, their ability to adapt. Some threw themselves into the challenge, studying European etiquette as carefully as if it were a school subject. determined to prove that they could fit into any society, no matter how ancient. Others bristled quietly, holding on to their American ways, laughing too loudly on purpose, wearing their jewels boldly as if to say, "If money is the reason you invited me here, then I will not apologize for the way I shine." Imagine one of these dinners, perhaps in a great London townhouse. The long table is set with crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and candles flickering against mirrored walls. At one end sits a duke, at the other his new American bride. Around them, guests whisper about her accent, about her gown, about the fortune she brought with her. Some smile politely, others judge silently, but everyone notices her. She lifts her glass. She speaks with a brightness that some find charming and others find too bold, but in either case she cannot be ignored. That, in many ways, was the essence of these first impressions. Whether loved or criticized, the dollar princesses made their presence known. The press, of course, played its part in shaping these impressions. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic reported breathlessly on what the new brides wore, how they behaved, and how they were received. Readers devoured the details: how many carriages lined up outside their parties, how many pearls were sewn into their dresses, what jewels sparkled in their tiaras. Every appearance became news, and every gesture was amplified. For Americans back home, it was a source of pride to see their daughters written about in European papers. For Europeans, it was a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Were these women truly worthy of the titles they had gained, or were they simply buying their way into history? Sometimes the first impressions were kinder than expected. There were noble families who welcomed the Americans warmly, who admired their confidence and even envied their freshness. Not every European saw them as outsiders. Some saw them as exactly what their society needed: a burst of energy, a reminder that life could be lived with laughter as well as restraint. And sometimes love did play its part. There were marriages where affection grew, where the nobleman admired not just the fortune but the woman herself, and where the bride found joy in the traditions she had entered. But more often it was a delicate balancing act. The young women learned quickly when to speak and when to stay silent, when to display their wealth and when to hide it, when to laugh freely and when to lower their gaze. They learned to move through rooms where every glance was a test, every smile a measure, every word a chance to prove themselves. It was not easy, but for many, it became a skill as finely tuned as any performance. And in time, some of them not only adapted, but began to influence the society they had joined, blending American boldness with European tradition in a way that created something new. Looking back, those first impressions reveal the heart of the Dollar Princess story. It was never just about money, never just about titles. It was about two worlds colliding, one full of old rules and fading wealth, the other bursting with new fortunes and restless energy. The first meetings, the first dinners, the first dances between these worlds were sometimes awkward, sometimes dazzling, always unforgettable, and though not every bride was loved, and not every union was admired, each one left a mark on the society that judged them. And so, as the candles flickered in European ballrooms and the carriages rolled down cobbled streets, the whispers of first impressions followed these women everywhere. Too loud, too rich, too bold, too bright, yet always present, always noticed, always at the center of attention. They may not have fit the mold perfectly, but in their own way, they reshaped the mold itself. What began as curiosity and skepticism slowly turned into a recognition that the dollar princesses, whether welcomed or resisted, were here to stay. Among all the young women who crossed the Atlantic in search of titles, none became more famous than Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her story was told and retold in newspapers, whispered about in drawing rooms, and remembered for years afterward as the perfect example of what it meant to be a dollar princess in 1895. Consuelo was the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and Alva Vanderbilt, part of one of the richest families in America. The Vanderbilts had built their empire on railroads and shipping, and their fortune seemed endless. Their homes in New York and Newport were palaces in their own right, filled with marble staircases, grand ballrooms, and art collected from across Europe. But for all their wealth, they still longed for something that money alone could not buy, and Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo's mother, knew exactly what that was. She wanted her daughter to marry into European nobility, to secure not just a fortune, but a title, a place in history that no one could sneer at. Consuelo herself, however, was not eager for this destiny. She was tall, beautiful, and admired, with soft features and a grace that people often compared to royalty itself, but her heart leaned in another direction. She had dreams of love, of choosing her own partner, of living a life that was not dictated by contracts and negotiations. Yet her mother, Alva, was determined, and Alva was not the kind of woman to be denied. Strong-willed, ambitious, and relentless, she believed that her daughter's marriage could be the crowning jewel in the Vanderbilt family's rise from wealthy outsiders to respected figures in both America and Europe. The man chosen for Consuelo was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was a handsome English aristocrat with one of the grandest titles in Britain, and he was heir to Blenheim Palace, a vast estate built in the early 1700s as a gift to the great military hero, the 1st Duke of Marlborough. Blenheim was magnificent, with its sweeping gardens, vast stone halls, and history that tied directly into the heart of England. But by the 1890s, Blenheim was crumbling under debts. The Duke had the title, but he did not have the money to maintain his estate. What he needed was wealth, and Consuelo Vanderbilt had exactly that. The arrangement was clear from the beginning. Consuelo would bring a dowry so large it could restore Blenheim Palace to its former glory. In return, she would become a duchess, one of the highest-ranking titles in Britain, outranking nearly everyone except the royal family itself. To Alva, this was not only a marriage but a victory, a statement that her family had finally claimed a place at the top of society. To Consuelo, however, it was a different story. She was barely 18 when the marriage was arranged, and she resisted with all the spirit of a young woman who wanted her life to belong to her. She wept, she protested, she begged her mother to reconsider, but Alva was unshakable. She reminded Consuelo of her duty, of the expectations placed on her, and in the end, Consuelo yielded, swept into a destiny she had not chosen. The wedding, held in 1895, was a spectacle that captured the attention of both America and Europe. Crowds gathered outside the church, newspapers sent reporters to describe every detail, and society buzzed with the drama of it all. Consuelo wore a gown of ivory satin, embroidered with silver and trimmed with lace, and her veil was so long it trailed behind her like a river. Around her neck sparkled the Vanderbilt pearls, a necklace so famous it had been written about in countless society columns. She looked the picture of a fairy tale bride, but behind her veil, her eyes were heavy with tears. It is said that Consuelo cried on her wedding day, not from joy, but from sorrow at the life she was being forced into. Still, the ceremony went on, the vows were spoken, and in that moment she became the Duchess of Marlborough. The newspapers hailed it as the marriage of the century. They printed photographs of Consuelo, described her gown in glowing detail, and spoke of how American wealth had once again saved a great English estate. Blenheim Palace, with its cracked walls and fading gardens, would now be restored, funded by the Vanderbilt fortune. The Duke had secured the money he needed, and Alva had secured the title she wanted for her daughter. On the surface, it looked like a perfect match, the kind of union that defined the very idea of a dollar princess. But beneath the glitter, the reality was far more complicated. Life at Blenheim was not easy for Consuelo. The palace was beautiful, yes, but it was also cold, vast, and filled with traditions that left little room for comfort. She was expected to behave according to the strictest rules of British society, to host dinners, attend ceremonies, and carry herself with the restraint and dignity of a duchess at all times. Every move she made was watched, every word weighed, every gesture noted. To a young woman raised in the lively, freer atmosphere of New York society, it felt suffocating. Her husband, the Duke, was distant, focused more on the restoration of his estate than on his young bride. Their marriage, though grand on paper, was not filled with love. Consuelo played her role with grace because she had no choice, and she became admired in British society for her beauty, her elegance, and her ability to adapt. But behind closed doors, she often felt trapped, a bird in a gilded cage, her wings clipped by duty and expectation. She wrote later in her memoirs about the loneliness she felt, about the heavy hand of responsibility that came with her title. And yet, despite her struggles, she fulfilled her duty. She gave the Marlborough line heirs, ensuring that the family legacy continued. She stood at the side of her husband in public, attended the grandest events, and played her part so convincingly that few realized how heavy the role weighed on her. Her story became the most famous example of what it meant to be a dollar princess. On the outside, it was triumph. An American girl rising to one of the highest ranks in British society, her fortune saving a palace, her name tied forever to a noble house. On the inside, it was sacrifice. A young woman giving up her freedom, her love, and much of her happiness for the sake of her family, as ambition, and society as the approval. In many ways, Consuelo's life was the embodiment of the entire phenomenon. It showed the glitter and the glamour that fascinated the world, but it also revealed the shadows hidden behind the jewels and the titles. As the years passed, her marriage grew colder, and eventually she found the courage to seek a different path. But in 1895, when she first became the Duchess of Marlborough, the world looked at her as the shining star of the dollar princesses. Her face appeared in newspapers, her name was spoken in admiration, and her story captured the imagination of people on both sides of the Atlantic. She was young, beautiful, wealthy, titled, and yet, quietly, deeply unhappy. And that is what makes her story so haunting even now. It reminds us that behind the sparkle of history, behind the headlines and the gowns, there were real people with real hearts, caught in arrangements that often left them longing for something more. And so, as Consuelo stepped into Blenheim Palace for the first time, her pearls glistening in the candlelight, her new title echoing in the halls she carried with her, not just the Vanderbilt fortune, but also the weight of an entire world watching. For some, she was a triumph. For others, a symbol of sacrifice. For herself, she was a young woman walking into a future she had not chosen, her steps heavy with duty, her heart quietly breaking, even as the world cheered her on. Life inside the castles was not always what the young American brides had imagined when they first heard about dukes and earls and countesses. To the outside world, it sounded like a dream. Grand staircases that wound upward into towers, halls lined with portraits of ancestors in shining armor, gardens stretching as far as the eye could see. But the reality, once the doors closed and the visitors went home, was often colder, quieter, and lonelier than the imagination had promised. Many of the estates were centuries old, built in times when comfort was not the same as in the gilded mansions of Fifth Avenue. Walls were thick and drafty, windows rattled when the winds blew across the countryside, and fireplaces were never quite enough to chase away the damp chill that seeped into the stones. To a young woman who had grown up in modern American houses with new plumbing, warm rooms, and electric lights beginning to appear, the castles felt both majestic and unforgiving. Everyday life in these estates followed traditions that had been set long before the brides were even born. Meals were served at certain times, not a minute earlier or later. Guests were seated in careful order, based not on preference but on rank, so that everyone knew their place in the invisible hierarchy. The host and hostess were expected to carry themselves with absolute dignity, to remember the names and titles of dozens of visitors, to maintain conversations that balanced wit with restraint. For the American women who had been raised in livelier, less formal households, the strictness could feel suffocating. A laugh that was too loud, a story that was too personal, A gesture that seemed too familiar could all be whispered about afterward as evidence that she did not fully belong. The castles themselves demanded endless attention. Servants scurried through their halls, polishing silver, tending fires, carrying trays, and opening doors. But even with dozens of staff, the sheer size of the estates made them difficult to maintain. Some rooms stayed locked, unused for years, simply because there was not enough money or staff to keep them open. Dust gathered in forgotten corners, and corridors echoed with silence rather than music. The great ballrooms, though dazzling when filled with light and guests, could feel empty and cold on quiet nights, their chandeliers swaying gently in the draught. For the new duchesses and countesses, there was often a sense of being surrounded by beauty that was at the same time a burden, a home that was too large to ever feel fully lived in. And then there were the rules, endless rules that seemed to govern every part of daily life. Rules about how many times one must attend church each week, rules about which family traditions must be upheld during holidays, rules about how one addressed distant relatives with the proper titles. A young American bride might find herself corrected for the smallest mistake, offering her hand before being introduced, speaking too freely at dinner, or failing to recognize the rank of someone she had just met. These were not the warm, casual gatherings she had known in America. These were rituals that had been performed for centuries, and breaking them was seen not as a small slip, but as a sign of unworthiness. It was not unusual for the brides to feel lonely, surrounded by servants who addressed them formally, by relatives who viewed them with suspicion, by neighbors who came to dinner only to whisper afterward. Many of them longed for the comfort of their families back in New York or Newport. Letters became lifelines, pages filled with news from home, carefully folded and reread by candlelight. Some wrote about their struggles, though often in hushed tones, as if ashamed to admit that the castles that had been painted as fairy tales were in truth places of isolation. And yet there was also grandeur, and sometimes even pride in the lives they built within those walls. Hosting a dinner for 20, 40, or even 100 guests was no small task, and when they succeeded, the admiration could be real. Walking through the gardens of their estates, overseeing renovations funded by their dowries, or standing at the head of a ballroom filled with music and laughter, they must have felt at times the thrill of what they had achieved. They were no longer outsiders. They were duchesses, countesses, ladies of the manor, and their names were printed in newspapers across 2 continents. Still, the contrast between their old lives and their new ones was sharp. In America, they had been free to ride bicycles through the streets, to attend summer picnics by the seaside, to laugh openly at parties. In Europe, their days were filled with duties, charity work, formal visits, church services, and endless preparation for events that seemed designed more to preserve tradition than to spark joy. Even the way they dressed was scrutinized. Too much jewelry was seen as vulgar. Too little was seen as careless. Their gowns had to be perfectly tailored, their hair arranged in styles that matched the latest European fashions, their every appearance polished and precise. The marriages themselves were often reflections of the castles, beautiful on the outside but cold within. Some husbands were kind but distant, treating their brides more as business partners than companions. Others were strict, insisting on obedience and tradition above all else. Few of these marriages were built on love alone. They were arrangements, and while affection sometimes grew, more often it did not. For the young women, it was a lesson in endurance. They learned to smile through dinners, to dance through balls, to host with grace, even when their hearts felt heavy. And yet, for all the struggles, the castles did hold a kind of magic. On summer mornings, when the sun lit the stone walls and the gardens bloomed with roses, when the horses waited in the stables and the air smelled fresh and green, the estates must have felt like something out of a dream. On winter nights, when fires roared in the hearths and snow dusted the turrets, the castles could glow with a warmth that seemed almost enchanted. There were moments of beauty that could not be denied, moments when the weight of duty lifted, if only for an evening, and the fairy tale seemed real again. For many of the brides, life in the castles became a mixture of both worlds: hardship and wonder, duty and pride, sacrifice and triumph. They gave up freedom for titles, love for legacy, comfort for grandeur. And in doing so, they left their mark not only on the estates they saved, but on history itself. Their fortunes repaired roofs, replanted gardens, and restored traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Their names were written into the family trees of noble houses, their children inheriting both American wealth and European heritage. They may not always have been happy, but they were unforgettable, woven into the story of two continents meeting in stone halls and candlelight. And so, inside those castles, the days stretched long, and the nights echoed with both silence and music. The American brides adjusted, endured, and sometimes even thrived, each one carving her place within walls that had stood for centuries. Their lives were not the fairy tales the newspapers promised, but they were real, filled with challenges and triumphs that gave depth to the glittering surface. And as the world watched their stories unfolded, not just in headlines, but in the quiet corridors of history, where every whispered complaint, every graceful curtsy, and every sacrifice told the truth of what it meant to live as a dollar princess in the grand but unyielding castles of Europe. When the young American women settled into their new roles among the nobility, it did not take long before people began to notice that they brought with them not only money but also style flair, and a certain boldness that Europe had not quite seen before. Fashion in the late 1800s was already a powerful language, one that spoke as loudly as words in drawing rooms and at dinner tables. The cut of a gown, the shimmer of a jewel, the tilt of a hat could declare status, taste, and confidence. For the dollar princesses, fashion became a way not only to express themselves, but also to carve a place in societies that sometimes resisted them. They may have been whispered about as outsiders, but when they walked into a ballroom shimmering with satin and diamonds, they commanded attention in a way that could not be ignored. In America, these women had grown up with access to the finest dressmakers in New York and Paris. Their mothers spent fortunes ordering gowns from French designers, gowns made of silks and velvets, adorned with lace, pearls, and embroidery so delicate it seemed to float across the fabric. When they crossed the Atlantic, they did not leave that behind. Instead, they brought with them trunks full of gowns, each one carefully chosen to dazzle at dinners, at balls, and at court presentations. Europeans sometimes thought the styles too bright, too bold, too daring compared to the more restrained tones they were accustomed to. But even as some raised their eyebrows, others began to copy. What had once seemed shocking soon became the height of fashion, and the American women, once seen as outsiders, became leaders of style. Jewelry was another part of their entrance into European society. American fortunes had bought tiaras of diamonds, necklaces of pearls, bracelets of sapphires, and brooches that glittered under candlelight. A young duchess or countess arriving from New York could appear at her first European ball wearing a tiara that rivaled those of queens. For the old nobility, it was both impressive and unsettling. These were jewels not passed down from ancestors, not tied to centuries of history, but newly bought, fresh from the jewelers of Paris or London. Yet they sparkled just as brightly, and when worn with confidence, they had their own power. Slowly, those jewels, though new, became part of the ancient households they had married into, absorbed into the traditions of families that had once sneered at their origins. The dollar princesses also brought with them a different way of carrying themselves. European ladies were often trained to be reserved, to speak softly, to let their presence be felt with subtlety rather than boldness. The Americans, however, had grown up in households where laughter was louder, where opinions were shared more freely, where a woman might take a more active role in conversation. At first, this shocked their new relatives and neighbors, but over time, it began to charm. A duchess who could speak confidently, laugh openly, and engage in conversation with men as easily as women was not seen as vulgar for long. Instead, she became magnetic, someone people wanted to be around. In this way, the Americans began to change the atmosphere of the very society that had once judged them. Fashion was not just about clothes, of course. It was about influence. When a dollar princess hosted a ball, the gowns she wore, the flowers she chose, even the way the tables were set became subjects of discussion. Guests would whisper about the cut of her dress, the arrangement of her jewels, and by the following season, other women might be wearing similar styles. The energy of American fashion, more willing to take risks, to shine a little brighter, to stand out rather than blend in, began to ripple through European high society. What started as criticism soon turned into imitation, and that imitation turned into admiration. Some of the brides even became trendsetters beyond their immediate circles. Their portraits appeared in society magazines, their wardrobes described in detail, their choices copied by women who longed to bring a touch of modernity to their own appearances. A hat worn by a duchess with American roots might be replicated in Paris shops within weeks. A daring color choice for a gown might be debated at tea tables across London, with some saying it was too bold, others saying it was exactly what society needed. Slowly, bit by bit, the Americans reshaped not only the fortunes of the noble houses they entered, but also the look and feel of European high society itself. It was not just about fashion either, but about attitude. These women brought with them a sense of freshness that Europe, with its heavy traditions, sometimes lacked. They introduced livelier parties, brighter music, more daring decorations. They encouraged a style of entertaining that felt less restrained, less predictable, and in doing so, they made gatherings sparkle in new ways. Guests who had grown tired of the same old patterns found themselves delighted, even rejuvenated, by the American touch. It was as if these women, stepping into castles built centuries earlier, opened the windows and let in a breeze that carried something modern, something free. Of course, not everyone approved. Some of the older generation grumbled that their society was being cheapened by this new boldness, that tradition was being sacrificed for spectacle. They saw too many diamonds, too much laughter, too many colors in gowns that should have been quiet and dignified. But even they could not deny that the rooms felt livelier, the seasons more exciting, the newspapers filled with stories that people devoured eagerly. The criticism did not stop the influence. It only proved how deeply the Americans were being noticed. For the women themselves, fashion and style were tools, ways to assert their place in a world that might otherwise dismiss them. A well-chosen gown could silence whispers. A perfectly arranged ball could earn admiration. A tiara worn with dignity could turn suspicion into respect. They learned quickly how to use these tools, how to balance the fine line between too much and too little, how to make statements without saying a word. And in time, many of them no longer simply followed European traditions, but reshaped them, leaving behind legacies that went beyond dowries and titles. Imagine one of these women, perhaps a young duchess, standing at the top of a grand staircase as guests arrive for her ball. She wears a gown the color of deep emerald, a color bolder than most would have dared, and on her head rests a tiara glittering with newly purchased diamonds. The guests pause as they enter, some raising their eyebrows, others smiling with admiration. By the end of the night, they are talking of little else. Within weeks, emerald gowns appear in Paris shops, and by the next season, the color is the height of fashion. That was the power these women held, not just through money, but through the choices they made and the confidence with which they made them. So while the castles they entered were old, filled with dust and tradition, the women themselves brought something young and new. Through fashion, through laughter, through boldness, they left fingerprints on European society that could not be erased. They may have been called dollar princesses, but in truth, they were queens of style, rewriting the rules of what it meant to be elegant in a world that had once looked down on them. Their jewels may have been new, but their influence became timeless, woven into the very fabric of society, remembered long after the whispers of disapproval had faded. For all the glitter, the jewels, and the newspaper headlines that made the marriages of the dollar princesses look like fairy tales, the truth was often far less romantic once the doors of the castles closed. Behind the chandeliers and the gowns, many of these marriages turned out to be cold arrangements, built more on contracts than affection, more on financial necessity than on love. It was a truth that few spoke aloud at the time, but one that could be seen in the eyes of the young women who had crossed the Atlantic only to find themselves bound to husbands they barely knew and households that often felt more like prisons than homes. The very nature of these unions made love a difficult thing to expect. A duke or a count might have agreed to the marriage not because he had been swept away by the charm of his bride, but because her dowry could repair his estate, pay his debts, and secure his lifestyle. For the American families, the arrangement was equally practical. Their daughter's fortune might buy her a title, a crest, and an entry into European society. With such practical goals, romance was rarely part of the bargain. And so when the wedding was over and the guests had gone, the young women often found themselves alone with men who treated them less as companions and more as financial saviors, figures of duty rather than partners in affection. Imagine a young duchess, newly arrived at her husband's estate. The halls are grand, the gardens vast, but her husband spends his days with horses, with politics, or with friends at his club in the city. She sits at long dinner tables with too many empty chairs, speaking politely to relatives who eye her with suspicion, while the man she has married barely looks her way. She writes letters home to her mother, filling the pages with cheerful stories about the grand house. But between the lines, there are hints of loneliness, of disappointment, of longing for something more than the cold formality of her new life. Some of the marriages were even less kind. There were husbands who treated their brides with disdain, who saw them only as foreigners who had bought their way into a family. They resented the whispers in society that said their titles had been purchased, that their family honor had been traded for dollars. And in that resentment, they turned cold, sometimes cruel, leaving their wives to navigate their new worlds without comfort or support. For the young women, it was a painful reminder that wealth could buy a title, but it could not buy warmth, affection, or kindness. The contrast with their old lives made the disappointment even sharper. In America, they had been admired, courted, and celebrated as the jewels of New York society. They had danced freely at balls, laughed openly at dinners, and enjoyed the company of friends who shared their world. In Europe, they were suddenly bound by rules, restrained by duties, and often left alone in houses too large to ever feel like home. The sparkle that had once surrounded them began to fade, replaced by the heavy weight of expectation. Some of the dollar princesses managed to carve out lives of meaning despite the coldness of their marriages. They threw themselves into charity work, using their wealth to support hospitals, schools, and causes that gave them a sense of purpose. Others found solace in their children, pouring their love and energy into the next generation, even if their own marriages were loveless. But still, the sense of sacrifice lingered. They had given up freedom for duty, joy for responsibility, choice for obligation. Their titles glittered in society, but behind them, the women themselves often felt dimmed. The newspapers, of course, rarely reported these struggles. They preferred the fairy tale version, the photographs of gowns, the stories of castles restored, the glamorous dinners, and the carriages arriving at balls. To the public, the marriages still looked like triumphs, proof that American wealth and European nobility had found harmony. But those who lived inside the story knew that harmony was not always real. Beneath the surface, there were arguments, silences, tears behind closed doors. The fairy tale was only half the truth. And yet, not every marriage was entirely bleak. Some couples did find a kind of partnership, if not passionate love. Respect sometimes grew where affection had not been expected. A duchess might admire her husband's dedication to his estate, even if he was not tender in private. A count might respect his wife's intelligence, even if he had not married her for it. Small bonds could form, quiet threads of connection that made the coldness more bearable. But for many, it was not enough to fill the void that love might have filled. The dollar princesses themselves became symbols of this paradox. They were envied for their jewels, admired for their titles, and written about as if they had stepped into storybooks. But privately, they carried the heavy truth that the stories left out. They had secured places in history, yes, but often at the cost of their own happiness. Their lives remind us that wealth and status, for all their glitter, do not guarantee joy. They remind us that behind the photographs in the papers were real women, with hearts that longed for love, for laughter, for freedom, even as they sat beneath diamond tiaras in candlelit halls. The marriages also reveal something deeper about the world of 1895. They show us how much value society placed on appearances, on names, on titles, on the illusion of perfection. Families were willing to trade their daughters' futures for prestige, to sign contracts disguised as wedding vows, to sacrifice love for the sake of legacy. The women, caught in the middle, often bore the heaviest cost. They smiled in public, they curtsied gracefully, they played their parts, but in the quiet of their rooms, they must have wondered if the trade had truly been worth it. And so, while some castles rang with music and laughter, others echoed with silence. While some brides found moments of joy, others lived with regret. The dollar princesses became both the saviors of European estates and the silent sufferers of arranged unions, admired and envied on the outside, but often yearning on the inside for something simpler, something truer, something that money and titles could never buy. The lives of the dollar princesses were not only lived inside castles and ballrooms, they were lived on the pages of newspapers, whispered in drawing rooms, and carried in gossip that traveled faster than any ship across the Atlantic. Society at the time was hungry for stories, and the marriages between American heiresses and European nobles were irresistible. They had everything that captured the imagination of readers: glamour, wealth, titles, castles, and the hint of scandal. The newspapers could not get enough, and the public devoured every detail, as if each wedding, each dinner, each appearance at court were chapters in an ongoing fairy tale that everyone wanted to read. Reporters described the gowns in almost poetic detail. They wrote of ivory satin embroidered with silver, of veils that trailed behind brides like rivers of lace, of tiaras that glowed in candlelight as if they were crowns from legends. They listed the number of carriages waiting outside, the flowers filling the halls, the pearls sewn into the hems of dresses. They told their readers exactly how much money was exchanged in dowries, sometimes with numbers so high they seemed almost unreal. For ordinary people, reading about fortunes that could save castles and buy entire estates was both shocking and thrilling. These stories allowed them to step, if only in imagination, into a world far beyond their own. But the press did not stop at admiration. Gossip was as valuable as beauty, and whispers made headlines just as easily as jewels did. If a bride seemed too nervous on her wedding day, if a duke looked distracted during the ceremony, if a guest muttered that the Americans were too brash, the papers carried it within days. Readers wanted the drama, the imperfections that made these fairy tale marriages feel like real stories. Was the bride happy? Did the husband truly love her? Was the family grateful for the money, or resentful of the intrusion? These questions filled the columns, and everyone had an opinion. For the families themselves, this constant attention was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it gave them the recognition they craved. To see their daughters' names in European newspapers was proof that they had secured a place in history. On the other hand, it meant that every mistake, every slip of etiquette, every rumor was magnified for the world to see. A laugh that was too loud, a gown that was too bright, a look exchanged between husband and wife could be spun into stories that echoed from New York to London. The women who had once been admired in their own circles now found themselves living under a spotlight that never seemed to dim. The gossip was not limited to the press. Drawing rooms in London, Paris, and New York buzzed with conversation about the dollar princesses. Guests at parties whispered behind fans and glasses of champagne, debating whether the marriages were truly happy, whether the castles were really saved, whether the noblemen had been too quick to sell their titles for money. In New York, society mothers compared notes, proud if their daughters were mentioned in European papers, envious if another family had secured a grander title or a more dazzling wedding. In Europe, the older nobility judged quietly, deciding which of the newcomers had adapted gracefully and which still seemed out of place. It is easy to imagine how heavy this must have felt for the young women themselves. They were already carrying the burden of adapting to a new world, of pleasing husbands who often saw them only as dowries, of navigating traditions that felt foreign. Now, on top of all of that, they were being watched, written about, and judged by strangers who knew nothing of their hearts but everything about their gowns. Each step into a ballroom, each appearance at a dinner, each carriage ride through the streets became a performance, one that could not be abandoned even when they longed for privacy. And yet, some of them learned to turn the attention to their advantage. They realized that gossip could be shaped, that appearances could be managed, that society's hunger for stories could be used as a tool. By hosting the most spectacular parties, by wearing the most daring gowns, by making themselves the talk of the season, they could secure admiration even from those who whispered behind their backs. A clever hostess could control the narrative, feeding the press stories that made her look glamorous rather than awkward. A well-timed smile, a carefully chosen phrase, a perfectly executed curtsy could silence critics and create admiration where there had once been doubt. For the newspapers, the marriages of the dollar princesses became almost like serialized novels. Each new wedding was another chapter, each social season another installment. The readers followed along eagerly, comparing one bride to another, one fortune to another, one castle to another. The names of families like Vanderbilt, Gould, and Astor became familiar even to those who had never set foot in New York or London, their stories carried across oceans by the ink of the press. What made these stories so irresistible was the mixture of reality and fantasy. They were true enough to feel close, yet magical enough to feel far away. Ordinary readers could imagine the satin gowns and glittering tiaras, the horse-drawn carriages rolling through cobblestone streets, the candlelit dinners in castles with walls older than entire American towns. At the same time, they could shake their heads at the gossip, muttering about loveless marriages, about nobles who sold themselves for money, about young women forced into roles they did not want. The mixture of envy and criticism, admiration and disdain, made the dollar princesses endlessly fascinating. Even when the marriages turned sour, the press continued to report. A rumor of an argument, a whisper of separation, a glance of coldness between husband and wife became fodder for gossip columns. And when divorces did occur, as they sometimes did, the stories filled pages, with every detail examined as though it were a scandal from a play. For the women involved it was painful, but for society it was entertainment. The public had followed their stories from the moment they stepped onto ships, and they continued to follow them, even when the fairy tale began to crumble. Through it all, the dollar princesses remained at the center of attention, whether they wanted it or not. They were admired, envied, criticized, and judged. Their lives turned into headlines and conversations that stretched from one continent to another. Their gowns and jewels might have been dazzling, but their real legacy in those years was the endless fascination they inspired, the way their stories wove together the hopes and insecurities of both America and Europe. And so, in the quiet of their castles, they might have longed for privacy, but in the world outside their names were everywhere, their lives discussed by people who had never met them, their marriages analyzed as if they belonged not to themselves but to history. They were in a way trapped not only by their titles but by the gossip that never seemed to end, carried forward by a society that loved them as much as it judged them, that admired their sparkle while never letting them forget the cost of it. By the turn of the century, when the world began to move from the quiet elegance of the late Victorian era into the energy of the 20th century, the story of the dollar princesses had already woven itself deeply into history. What had started as a few carefully arranged marriages between American heiresses and European nobles had grown into a phenomenon, a pattern repeated again and again until it became almost expected. In less than a generation, more than 300 American women had crossed the Atlantic not only with trunks full of gowns, but with fortunes large enough to rescue entire estates. These marriages were more than personal unions. They were exchanges that reshaped families, properties, and even the balance between two continents. The legacy was visible first in the castles themselves. Estates that had been on the brink of collapse, their roofs leaking and their gardens overgrown, found new life. American money paid for repairs that had been postponed for decades, for wings of palaces to be reopened, for servants to be rehired, for parties to return to ballrooms that had long been silent. Visitors to England, France, and beyond could see the change. Where once there had been decay, now there was glitter once more. Where once noble families had whispered of debts, now they boasted of grand dinners and shining stables, though many quietly knew it was American wealth that had made the transformation possible. The Americans had not only entered European society, they had, in a way, preserved it. But the influence of the dollar princesses was not only financial. They brought with them a new spirit, one that lingered long after the headlines faded. Their laughter, their boldness, their willingness to shine more brightly than tradition sometimes allowed left ripples in the societies they joined. At first, they had been criticized for being too brash, too colorful, too eager, but over time, many Europeans came to admire their energy, their freshness, and their ability to breathe life into gatherings that had grown stale. The Americans changed not only the look of fashion but also the feel of society itself, infusing it with a liveliness that continued into the new century. The children of these marriages became their own kind of legacy. They carried both worlds in their names, both American fortunes and European titles, both the energy of a young nation and the history of an old one. Some grew to become influential in politics, society, and even the arts, their lives shaped by the unusual combination of their heritage. In them, the trade between money and titles became something deeper, something lasting, a true blending of two different worlds. Their presence proved that the marriages, though sometimes loveless, had not been without consequence. They created a new class of individuals who belonged to both continents, who could claim both Fifth Avenue and Blenheim Palace as part of their story. For America, the marriages were proof of its rise. Just a few decades earlier, the United States had been seen by many in Europe as a brash young nation, full of wealth but lacking refinement. By 1900, American names were carved into European family trees. American fortunes had saved historic estates, and American women were being addressed as duchesses and countesses. It was a powerful statement that money, though once dismissed as new, could not be ignored forever. The marriages symbolized the arrival of America not only as a financial power, but as a cultural force, one that Europe could no longer look down upon without also depending on. For Europe, the legacy was more complicated. On one hand, the influx of American wealth allowed many noble families to survive into the modern age, preserving traditions that might otherwise have vanished. On the other hand, it revealed the fragility of those traditions. Titles without money were no longer enough. Castles without fortunes were only empty shells. The old system of nobility had to bend to the realities of a changing world, and the marriages to American heiresses were a clear sign of that change. They showed that the future would not be built on lineage alone, but on a merging of history with new wealth, old names with new energy. The stories of the dollar princesses also left behind a kind of cautionary tale. For every grand success, there was a shadow of sacrifice. The young women who had been celebrated in newspapers and envied by their peers often paid a personal price that was hidden from the public eye. Some found happiness in their roles, but many did not. Their lives became symbols of ambition achieved, but also of personal dreams set aside. They taught the world that glamour and jewels, no matter how dazzling, could not erase the longing for love, for freedom, for a life chosen rather than arranged. Their legacy, therefore, is both glittering and sobering, a reminder that history often shines brightest on the surface while hiding shadows beneath. As time passed, the gossip faded, the headlines moved on, and the phenomenon of the dollar princesses began to wane. The world was changing again, and by the time the First World War arrived in 1914, society itself was shifting. The old aristocratic structures began to crumble under the weight of war and modernity, and the marriages that had once seemed so powerful became part of a past that was quickly disappearing. Yet their influence lingered, remembered in the estates that still stood, in the portraits that still hung in great halls, in the family names that carried both American and European legacies. Looking back, the legacy of the dollar princesses is more than just the story of women traded for titles. It is the story of two continents meeting at a moment in history when each needed the other. America needed validation, and Europe needed money. Together, through these marriages, they created a bridge that shaped the future in ways neither side could have fully imagined. The castles still standing, the family lines still alive, and the cultural exchanges that continued into the 20th century all trace their roots to the women who boarded ships in 1895 with trunks full of gowns and hearts full of uncertainty. And perhaps the greatest legacy of all is the fascination that remains. More than a century later, we still speak of them, still imagine their weddings, still wonder about their lives. We picture the jewels, the carriages, the castles, and the whispered scandals, but we also feel the pull of their choices, the mixture of admiration and sympathy that their stories inspire. They remind us that history is not only about battles and politics, but also about people, about dreams and sacrifices, about the way lives can shape the course of nations without ever intending to. So, as the 20th century dawned and the world moved forward, the dollar princesses remained, both in memory and in legacy. Their jewels may have been locked in cases, their gowns folded away, their names fading from the newspapers, but the mark they left on history was permanent. They were more than just daughters of wealthy men or brides of noble houses. They were symbols of a world in transition, of the meeting of new wealth and old tradition, of the glitter and the cost of ambition. And their legacy continues to echo, softly but clearly, in the stories we tell even now. And so, as the story of the dollar princesses reaches its gentle close, we are left with an image that feels both glittering and bittersweet. It is the image of a young woman standing at the edge of two worlds, one foot in the lively chaos of American wealth, the other stepping carefully into the solemn grandeur of European tradition. Around her are trunks of gowns and jewels. Behind her are the skyscrapers and railroads of a rising America. And ahead of her are castles that have stood for centuries, their stone walls whispering with history. The ocean stretches between, wide and endless, carrying her from what she has known to what she cannot yet imagine. And in that image is the heart of the story, a tale of hope and sacrifice, of triumph and sorrow, of dreams that sparkled like diamonds but sometimes weighed like chains. By 1895, the phenomenon was fully alive. Society on both sides of the Atlantic watched with fascination as one marriage followed another, each one seeming grander than the last. American families beamed with pride as their daughters gained titles. European nobles breathed sighs of relief as dowries filled their empty coffers, and newspapers filled their columns with details that set imaginations aflame. But beneath the headlines, the reality was quieter, more human. It was the reality of young women leaving behind familiar laughter for unfamiliar halls, of men trading pride for survival, of families measuring success not in love, but in names and numbers. History often remembers the glitter, but when we listen closely, we can still hear the echoes of hearts beating beneath the layers of silk and lace. The dollar princesses were more than symbols of their age. They were participants in the great story of change. They lived at a time when America was rising with a roar, when fortunes were being made faster than ever before, when railroads stitched the country together and oil flowed like liquid gold. They also lived at a time when Europe was holding tightly to its past, when castles were crumbling but traditions refused to fade, when titles still commanded respect even as the wealth that once supported them slipped away. The marriages of these women brought those two realities together, weaving them into a single thread that tied continents across the sea. Some of those women found strength in their new roles, turning themselves into leaders of fashion, hostesses of dazzling gatherings, patrons of art and charity, mothers of children who would carry on the legacy. Others felt the weight too heavily, their spirits bending under the expectations of duties they had not chosen, their laughter fading into silence behind the thick stone walls of their estates. Some stories ended in quiet contentment, others in longing, others still in eventual escape. But all of them shared the same beginning: a ship crossing the Atlantic, a dowry promised, a title gained. The legacy of those journeys still lingers. In the halls of Blenheim Palace, where Consuelo Vanderbilt once walked reluctantly as the Duchess of Marlborough, there are still whispers of her presence, reminders of the fortune that restored the estate. In Paris and London, in the pages of memoirs and the portraits hanging in gilded frames, the faces of American women who became European nobility still look out at us, their expressions caught between pride and melancholy. Their lives remind us that history is not only written in battles or politics, but in marriages, in dinners, in choices made by families in search of survival or ambition. And yet, for all the grandness of their stories, what makes them so haunting even now is their humanity. It is easy to see the diamonds, the carriages, the castles, and forget the young women inside them, women who once dreamed of love, of freedom, of lives they could shape for themselves. Their titles may have been written in ink on official papers, but their hearts still beat with the same hopes and fears as anyone else. To remember them is to remember not just the sparkle, but also the sacrifice, not just the triumph, but also the cost. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the world changed. The First World War swept across Europe, reshaping nations, altering societies, and dimming the glow of the old aristocracy. Many of the castles that had been saved by American fortunes faced new struggles, and the titles that had seemed so eternal began to lose their power. The marriages of the dollar princesses, once front-page news, became stories told in quieter voices, remembered by families, recorded in books, tucked into the folds of history. But they never disappeared entirely. Even now, more than a century later, we still turn to their stories, still imagine their gowns and jewels, still wonder what it must have felt like to step into such a life. And perhaps that is their final gift, not the estates they saved, not the titles they secured, but the fascination they continue to inspire. They remind us that history is alive with stories of individuals of choices made not in parliaments or battlefields, but in drawing rooms and churches. Choices that changed not only their own lives, but the course of families and nations. They remind us that behind every glittering crown, there is a story, often heavier than it appears. They remind us that the line between a dream and a burden is often thinner than a thread of pearls. So let us picture, one last time, the world of the dollar princesses. Imagine the candlelit ballrooms of New York, where music plays late into the night and young women laugh in gowns sparkling with sequins. Imagine the great ships crossing the Atlantic, their decks lined with passengers staring out at the endless horizon, their holds heavy with trunks filled with silks and jewels. Imagine the castles of Europe, their halls echoing with footsteps, their portraits watching silently as new brides step through doors that had stood for centuries. Imagine the whispers, the gossip, the admiration, the envy, the triumphs, and the tears. All of it woven together into a story that belongs not just to one family or one nation, but to an age of change, an age of ambition, an age of dreams that glittered as brightly as diamonds. And now, as we close the story, let the images drift softly in your mind. See the ocean calm and silver under the moonlight. Hear the faint notes of music from a distant ballroom. Feel the hush of history settling gently around you. The story of the Dollar Princesses is not one of fairy tales alone, but of reality, with all its beauty and all its shadows. It is a story of people, of choices, of lives lived in a time both far away and strangely close. And as you let your thoughts wander, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine yourself boarding that ship, walking those halls, wearing those jewels, living for a moment inside the dream and the burden of history. And then, with the sound of the ocean in your ears and the flicker of candlelight in your eyes, let the story fade into silence, carrying you gently into sleep.